Hi, good morning. So, firstly, thank you to the organizers, the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication, the faculty members, Dr. Arora, who was here, Aditya, Neeraj, uh, Tausif sir, who sent the invite, Aishwarya, who wasted her morning in getting us to the college, and especially to the two sets of singers and composers who sang wonderfully. I don't think my speech or Vineet's speech would be any match to the fierceness of the lyrics and the meaning of what was delivered in those songs. But I will try. Uh, Thankfully, Vineet went first, and it made my job easier because Aditya and Vineet have already put into context what we are going to discuss. But I thought that since Vineet is a filmmaker and I am a professor in a college, Vineet should be allowed to speak like a professor and I should be allowed to talk like a film person. So I think I'll do a film view of Ambedkar's life today, and we'll not make it linear. That's the in thing. Nolan is the in thing, so we'll make it non-linear. We'll cut into different scenes of Ambedkar's life, because what I want to talk about is there's a duality in Ambedkar's life, right? Something that has been mentioned in the last few minutes. But before I go there, I just want to tell everyone who's here that it's perfectly fine to not turn up for such an event. We are used to this. When we started the Ambedkar Reading Group in 2017, for the first 8 months nobody came, so we could not really do much. Thankfully then we started seeking out, and people like Aditya joined the group, and with that the group became bigger, and now we do our meetings online. Similarly, with our film club that we have started, which again Aditya has been managing in Jharkhand, there are very few people who turn up for such events. So the number of people who turn up for these events is never a problem. So I think the people who are missing out really don't have to feel bad about it. And of course, thanks to everybody who did turn up. The numbers really don't matter in the long run. And this is something that we would know from Ambedkar's life. So let me come to that part straight away. Like Vineet mentioned, Ambedkarite politics has become reduced to elections now. Right, that is the only time we heard of Dr. Ambedkar. That is the only time he's remembered by all parties. Right, the pledge of service is taken in the name of the Constitution, and the de facto writer of the Constitution is Dr. Ambedkar. And hence, everything about elections have sort of come back to the question of Ambedkar. But how did Ambedkar fare in elections himself? When Ambedkar fought these elections, did he have the support to actually win anything? And the answer is a very resounding no. Ambedkar contested 3 major general elections in India, and he lost all of them. And I will describe the margin of losses and the manner of losses too. Right? Just to illustrate the point that the numbers are not important. Because I'm pretty sure the people who won against Ambedkar in those 3 elections, nobody remembers or cares about them anymore. Right? So the first time during the constitution making, when he fought the election, was in 1946, and he's fought from Bombay, that was his home state, and he lost very badly. And because he lost that election, he could not have entered the Constituent Assembly. Only the people who won in that election were allowed to become a member of the Constituent Assembly. So he was nominated as a member from the Bengal state. Right? There were options of nominating members too. Only elected representatives were not there. There were some nominated members too. So he was sent in from Bengal. Right? That was the first time Ambedkar fought in a nearly free India and lost. The first general elections took place in 1951-52. And by then Ambedkar had his own party. He had already drafted the constitution by 1950. In 1951-52 he fought again from the North Bombay constituency, and it was contested by just 4 people. Right? Ambedkar came 4th. He had the least number of votes. The Congress representative won the election by a huge margin of about 20,000 people, which was huge back then, because the population of India was less than 1/10 of what it is today. And the Communist Party and the Swaraj Party, they all did better than Dr. Ambedkar himself, right? So 1951-52, the first elections happened. Ambedkar doesn't even have enough support to win a basic election. In 1954, a by-election took place for the Bhandara constituency, right? He fought again, thinking that maybe if he fought outside of Bombay, where the industrialists and the other big parties were not against him, and where the Mahars and the Dalits were in bigger numbers, he would win rather comfortably. The by-elections were contested by 4 people again, and Ambedkar came third. So he lost the 1954 by-elections as well. So he was not in the Indian Parliament as an elected representative. He was nominated to the Rajya Sabha again as a nominated member, and that is how he became the Minister of Law. Right? He could not win an election in his life. He did in 1937, but that was much before any of these constitutional methods came along. So the numbers don't matter, because if numbers really did matter, and elections are all that mattered, Ambedkar would not have been remembered, because the people who fought those elections and won those elections have been forgotten in history. So why do we remember Ambedkar, and how do we remember Ambedkar is the important question, right? So one of the finest thinkers who are alive today on the anti-caste tradition, also coming from a leftist tradition, is Professor Aloysius. Professor Aloysius lives in Chennai, and he has written a fantastic book called Nationalism Without a Nation in India. And when he was asked if he could be able to describe Ambedkar in one word, he said Ambedkar can be described only as a Democrat, right? So if he, as probably the most learned scholar of Ambedkar, thought that Ambedkar can only be described as a Democrat, there has to be some meaning, some sense to that. Now, but the more important thing is what he means by a Democrat and what he means by democracy. And that is something that we need to remember when we sit here, when we attend the classes. And since I teach political science and history in college, Indian Constitution is the absolute center of all these courses. What democracy means is extremely important. Democracy essentially is opposed to the concept of merit. Merit is antithetical to democracy. You do not have to qualify as somebody to become an equal, right? Everybody in India was allowed to contest in the elections and vote with the constitution. That was one of the most radical things that Ambedkar did in the constitution. The British constitution got formulated in 1688. Women got a voting right in Britain in 1922. That's over 240 years that it took Britain to give voting rights to women. America had their constitution ready by 1787, and the blacks and the women were fighting for an equal right to vote until 1860s and 70s, right? So the fact that the Indian constitution allowed everybody to vote from day one is to be considered radical, and that is the democratic legacy of Dr. Ambedkar. So what is democracy and who is a Democrat? Let's say there's an uneducated person who does not qualify anything. He's not smart enough, he's not eloquent enough, he hasn't studied anything at all, and he cannot sit in discussions, he cannot give these speeches, he's not even good enough to earn his livelihood. But is he unequal compared to somebody who has all these qualities? Somebody who's very well read, who's come from Harvard, somebody who has a lot of money, somebody who has a lot of property, a lot of connections, he comes from a place of privilege. Democracy essentially is to treat these two people as equals, and there is no other meaning to democracy in constitutional terms than to say that there is no qualification that is required to become equal. We are equal irrespective of who we are, right? There's just an age barrier on who can vote and who can't, but as far as the genders and castes and races are concerned, everybody is allowed to vote equally. So that is the basis of democracy anywhere. The stupidest person has to be considered wise enough to know the difference between good and bad. And it is on this faith And on this principle that constitutions are supposed to work, that even if you think somebody is the stupidest person in the country, he should be allowed to vote, and his vote will have the same value with the person who is deemed as the smartest person in the country. Now that is what elections and democracy fundamentally mean. But of course, that is now how it has turned out. It has turned out very differently, like you know. So the topic that I gave Aditya was, do we take Ambedkar as an intellectual, who in Gramsci's term would fit into the category of an organic intellectual, since he came from a Dalit family and he rose up the ranks and became quite easily the most well-educated person that India has produced. Like there's probably no competition. The degrees that Gandhi, Nehru, Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan, Patel had put together would not weigh anything against Ambedkar's degrees. So do we remember Ambedkar as a man who had read so much, who had so many degrees from the London School of Economics and the School of Oriental and African Studies from the University of Columbia, a lot of honorary degrees of PhDs coming from Japan and US and Hyderabad and so on. So if you could just list his degrees, we'll probably exhaust the time today. Do we remember him as an intellectual, or do we remember him as the person who organized the Mahad Satyagraha, who burnt the Manusmriti, and who after drafting the constitution was probably also willing to burn the constitution? Ambedkar as an organizer and Ambedkar as an original thinker of economics has probably not received as much attention as Ambedkar as the constitutional expert. But there are a couple of things that we need to reflect on in the next 5 to 7 minutes to understand how Ambedkar was managing this duality. The duality of being an intellectual and of being a mass organizer and an agitator and a politician who was working on the ground continuously. The Baba Saheb Ambedkar writings and speeches, those volumes, go on till 22 volumes, right? And the number of pages is around 12 or 13,000. So that is the amount of literature Ambedkar left with his speeches and writings. That's one way of remembering Ambedkar. Like Aditya was mentioning, in 90s, or probably Vineet was mentioning, there was a call to rescue Ambedkar from drawing rooms and put him back into the books. It's probably time to take Ambedkar out of the books and put him back into the streets. Right? Since a lot of you are students of cinema, if you followed the history of cinema, in 1920s, 30s and 40s, all the murder mysteries would take place on the streets. Right? All the murders that happened in movies were happening on the streets. You were on a highway and somebody would kill you. You were going to shopping and somebody would kill you. Then somebody called Alfred Hitchcock came along and then he made a lot of murder mysteries, right? And what was the common theme in all the murder mysteries of Alfred Hitchcock? It was that all the murders happened inside rooms, inside homes, in front of TV sets. So Hitchcock put murders from the streets into the drawing rooms. We have put Ambedkar from those statues into our course books, into these lectures, into a lot of intellectual discussions. But the Ambedkar who existed in Mahad, the Ambedkar who existed in the Bombay textile mills mobilization, the Ambedkar who burnt books despite writing thousands of books, has probably been lost. So it is this duality of Ambedkar that should be his abiding legacy. The fact that he could write, to start with, caste, genesis and mechanism, which is the work of anthropology, and then he wrote Annihilation of Caste, which is mostly a historical social documentation. Then of course, between that he wrote his PhD thesis, which is The Problem of Rupee, which is the work of economics. Then he of course wrote the Constitution, which is the work of law. So this is a man who's a master of so many fields and he's writing volumes and volumes of books, but at the same time he has the time and the good faith to go back to the people. One of his last speeches, Ambedkar pointed out that if there is one class of people he is most disappointed with, It is the intellectual class of Dalits and others who are following him, right? Ambedkar was very critical of this new form of intellectualization of movements, something that we do in classrooms, something that we do in lecture halls, something that we do in colleges, in speeches. So I think if Ambedkar has to be kept relevant today, he needs to be put back into the streets, and we'll have to probably undo what Hitchcock did with murders. We'll have to put Ambedkar back onto the streets. And for that, we need to remember a couple of things about Ambedkar that we sometimes miss. Now, I think in these slides, somewhere in these slides, I can't recall which one, but the Factories Act was mentioned. In 1881 and 1891, two Factories Acts were passed in India. Right, this is British India, of course. And what was that Factories Act about? So, the age of people who could work in those factories, the working hours, the maternity benefits and so on were not extended to the people. So a lot of people fought, and in India there were a lot of groups arguing for better conditions of workers in factories. So the age of people who could work in factories was first reduced to 9 years, and then it was further taken up to 13 years in 1891. Funnily, now this is the important part of the story, the act is not important. The people who were resisting this act were the biggest Indian industrialists like Naroji, like Firoz Shah Mehta, like a lot of Bengali industrialists. And they thought that the only competitive advantage they had in the industrial economy in the world was that they had cheap labor, and they could exploit that cheap labor in India, and they could sell those products at much lower prices in the world market compared to the factories in England, in Manchester and Liverpool. So the Indian industrialists did not want the Factories Act passed, both of them. There was a lobby in London that really wanted those acts passed, because they thought that Indian industrialists were getting a competitive advantage of producing cheap labor enabled clothes, and hence if this went on, India would win back the cloth market in the world. So they were lobbying for these acts that were for the betterment of the workers, which were primarily Dalits and Bahujans. The Indian industrial class, which was made up of the upper caste, was fighting against these laws so that they would not lose that competitive advantage. The important thing is that when we think of laws and when we think of the biggest law called the Constitution, it is not just what is written there in that law, in the Constitution, that is important. It is also why it was put there in the first place and what purpose it serves in the long run. Laws are made for very specific time and very specific spaces in a very specific context. Similarly, the Constitution is also made for a very specific time and a very specific context. Ambedkar could live this duality very well. He was organizing the Mahad Satyagraha. The Mahad Satyagraha is where, I'm sure you've seen that picture, the Chowra tank photograph. It's okay if the photo is not there, but the interesting story is something else. Now, when he mobilizes 20,000 people to get to that tank, yeah, this is that picture, right? The entire police was against it. The people who owned the tanks, traditionally, the Brahmins and the upper caste, they were against it. And there was a lot of violence. That is the part that gets missed out. During this mobilization, while getting to this place of water and while going back, there was a lot of violence. And a lot of people were hurt. Right. This is the story from where Ambedkar starts getting unpopular among the untouchables, because Congress and a lot of other parties start telling the untouchables that Ambedkar led you to something that eventually hurt you. You were hurled at with stones and you were beaten by the police lathis because you followed him blindly to this water tank. Ambedkar's argument was that buffaloes were allowed to wash themselves in these tanks, but Dalits were not allowed to drink water. He wanted to bring parity between all human beings. So Ambedkar sensed that this event had also probably made him unpopular among some of the untouchables, and Congress could use this opportunity to mobilize against him. What did Ambedkar do after that? Ambedkar started a journal called Bahishkrut Bharat, the Abandoned India. And he started raising these concerns and these questions and started this in form of pamphlets in newspapers so that it could reach everyone. He knew that the books that he was writing would probably not reach 99% of the Dalits that he was representing in most cases, and hence he felt the need to start a lot of journals, so apart from those 22,000 words of Baba Sahib volumes, which is Annihilation of Caste and Who Were the Shudras and so on, he also had 3 weeklies, right? He started Mook Nayak, and then he started Bahishkrut Bharat, and then he started another newspaper in 1930, and eventually he started Prabhuddha Bharat. And why he was doing that was because he wanted to organize people at the same time as he was investing himself in all the intellectual activities, his intellectual pursuits of economics, of law, of anthropology. For Ambedkar, that life had no contradiction. To work as a scholar and to work as an activist and organizer, there was no difference between these two things. And I think I would like to end by reiterating this fact, that the fact that Ambedkar has been reduced to an intellectual figure who is to be read and discussed, which is one reason why at Ambedkar Reading Group we are always wondering if we should continue being a reading group or we should just abandon this reading group name, because that is really not what we want to achieve alone. One big problem with Ambedkar sitting in libraries and seminar halls is that the productive capacity of Ambedkar as a radical organizer has been somewhere lost in this entire hubris of academic journals and seminars and so on. Right? So if there's any abiding legacy that we must remember Ambedkar by, I think it is the fact that it is possible to organize on the ground and educate people through writings and speeches at the same time. Thank you for being very patient and for inviting me here. Jai Bhim and happy Ambedkar Jayanti.